So, so welcome back from the break. Let's answer the concept question and then we'll move on. So how did Hutton's and Lyell's ideas influence the thinking of both Darwin and Wallace? Well, remember, Hutton and Lyell proposed that the nature of the geology of the Earth suggested, excuse me, very strongly that the Earth had to be significantly older than the young Earth divine creation model would account for. That the geological processes that they had observed and realized were involved in shaping the Earth meant that not only was the Earth old, it must be much older, because the only way that these processes, working gradually over long periods of time, could lead to the large changes in the shape of the Earth that they were able to observe, could only have done so if the Earth was substantially older than 6,000 years. And that would leave room for the process of natural selection to take place. But it also influenced Darwin and Wallace, because remember that Darwin and Wallace proposed that changes in organisms over time would be gradual and slow in small increments, leading to the accumulation of small incremental changes that would give rise to a large change. So basically, they took the uniformitarian gradualist approach that Hutton and Wallace had proposed for geology and applied it to biology, and said that the Earth evolves over time because of these gradual geological changes, and organisms evolve over time because of gradual biological changes, what would become known as natural selection. So that's how Hutton and Lyell, at two levels, influenced the thinking of Darwin and Wallace. So what is Darwinian evolution all about? Well, I've given you the background history, so I'm not going to spend any time talking about these slides. You can read them at your leisure if you wish. I'm going to keep moving through this. This is a map of Darwin's voyage around the world. You can see he visited a number of different places. One of the key places he didn't visit, however, was the Malay Archipelago in Indonesia. This is the region that's highlighted here. This is Wallace's stomping ground. This is where he was collecting when he had his insights that would lead to his development of the idea of natural selection. Darwin did visit this island. This is Christmas Island, if I remember rightly. It is considered to be an outlying, perhaps representative of the Malay Archipelago. It is at quite a distance from the Indonesian island, so it has a few species that may have been derived from species in the archipelago. It's not entirely clear, and it certainly wasn't in Darwin's time. But you can see that Darwin visited a lot of locations, spent a lot of time in South America, because that is primarily where the Beagle was doing its work. It was mapping the coastline of South America. That's why it went out in the first place. Did visit the Galapagos, and of course, most people know about Darwin's work in the Galapagos. Ironically, while people point to the finches as being the thing that influenced Darwin's thinking the most, we do know from his notebooks that it wasn't the finches at all. It was the tortoises, the giant tortoises. Because what Darwin realized in thinking about the tortoises was the observation, or the simple fact, that the people who lived in the Galapagos could tell you exactly which island any tortoise came from simply by looking at the shell, the pattern on the back, and the shape of the shell. And that implied to Darwin that each of the islands had its own unique population of tortoises, even though they looked very similar at first glance. It was quite clear on the basis of what the people could do and from his own small collection of tortoises that he collected while they were in the islands, that each of the islands had their own unique species of tortoises. And the question he started to ask himself was, where did each of these species of tortoises come from? If they are all somewhat similar to each other, why are they also very different? And how could he explain all of this? And that's what started him thinking. It was the tortoises, not the finches. It would be an ornithologist friend of Darwin's working with Darwin's finches, who would then inform Darwin as to just what he had in that collection of finches. That would only occur after he got back to England. And in fact, he really didn't start to shape his ideas of natural selection until he got back to England. But the finches would remain a puzzle to him for a couple of years until his ornithologist friend actually got a chance to really look at the collection of finches that Darwin brought back with him and started to realize exactly what it was that Darwin had amongst that collection of finches. That would then, of course, add more data to what Darwin was already starting to think about on the basis of the other organisms that he'd been collecting. Darwin realized that he needed specialists in the types of organisms that he had. So he didn't just keep these specimens to himself. He did rely on other people to take a look at his collection and to help him evaluate his collection. So he did take advantage of the people that he knew that were specialists in the different types of organisms that he had collected, and paid attention to what they told him about the significance of his specimens and what they could actually tell him. So we'll keep moving through this. One of the things that Darwin did do was collect some fossils in South America. And when he examined these, when he got back to England again, what he realized was these fossils represented organisms that were somewhat closely related to the living organisms in South America and were somewhat distinctly South American, really didn't have any resemblance to any other organisms growing in similar sorts of environments. So if you think of South America as having some temperate regions, if you look in other temperate regions around the world, there is no similarity between the organisms of these various temperate regions. Each region has its own unique set of organisms, and Darwin recognized that the fossils also reflected that regionality, that the organisms in the fossil record were from the local region and were more closely related to the living organisms in South America than they were to any other group of organisms living anywhere else in the world. Very important observation, the regionality of organisms. So as he started to think about what he had seen, and remember, Wallace is doing a similar sort of thing as he's reaching his own conclusions. Took him a lot more time in terms of observations to come to the same conclusion, but he spent a lifetime collecting organisms. As I said, he collected organisms in South America. Also, he was collecting in Indonesia at the time, and he spent a lot of time in observation. So he had a very good knowledge of the organisms that lived in the different regions that he had visited, and that would again really spark his thoughts. But the book focuses mostly on Darwin's thoughts, so we'll just think in terms of Darwin. But just remember, Wallace is doing the same sort of processing of ideas based on his observations. So here are three of the finches, or three of the 16 finch species that live in the Galapagos. And when you look at the beaks, what you notice is that the beaks are different, but the beaks are an adaptation to the particular food sources that they're using. So an insect-eating finch needs a long, thin beak to catch the insects and to be able to probe into the bark of trees and into the soft tissue of plants in order to root out the insects that are living in the plant tissues. A cactus eater needs a larger finch, a larger beak, because it's got tougher tissue to process, but it doesn't need a really aggressive beak because it's not going to be cracking anything. It's still eating soft tissue. It may have to deal with spines. It may have to be able to reach in amongst spines or to be able to break the spines off so that it can get access to the food that it's going to eat. But it's not going to need a really aggressive nutcracker type beak. But those that are seed eaters, they're going to need a much tougher beak to crack the seeds open, because the Galapagos do not get a huge amount of rain, which means that the seeds need to be protected from severe dehydration until such times as the rain falls to trigger germination of the seeds. So any bird that's going to feed on these seeds is going to need a reasonably tough beak in order to be able to crack those open. And if you go and take a look at the work of Peter and Rosemary Grant, which is documented in some videos that are available in the study area of the Mastering Biology learning tool, they will talk to you a little bit about the beak size, because it was their work of 30 years that enabled them to recognize the effect of rainfall on the shape of the beaks over time. And they were able to document that the size of the beaks would change in direct correlation with the amount of rainfall that was falling. So in years where there was a good rainfall, in subsequent years, the size of the beaks on the finches was a little bit smaller because the seeds were a little bit easier to break open. They were smaller and easier to feed on because of the types of plant species that were growing with the rainfall. If there was several years of drought, then the plant makeup of the environment would change. The seeds would become tougher to resist the dehydration, and that would be reflected in the size of the finches' beaks. They would get a little bit larger and a little bit stronger because they needed those beaks in order to be able to crack the seeds. And you could see these changes in the beak sizes over time. And this was the work of the Grants for 30 years to document these changes in beak sizes. Now, they have also done something else quite remarkable, and I'll discuss that later in this chapter when we talk about some of the evidence for evolution. So their work is also significant. In fact, the second thing that I'm going to talk about is even more remarkable and perhaps even more important. But you can see that these beaks are derivatives of the environment that the birds are living in. What Darwin recognized in talking to his ornithologist friend as he was describing the nature of the beaks was that all of these finches must have at one point originated from somewhere. And as he considered what he had seen, he realized that the obvious location for those finches in terms of origin was South America, which is only about 600 miles away. Yes, it's over open ocean, but it would be possible for strong storms to carry the birds across that ocean, and that's actually been documented. And Darwin realized that these finches must have populated the islands in small populations, forcibly migrated there by storms. They would not voluntarily have flown 600 miles. And that would be too difficult to accept. But a storm carrying them over those distances, that's more than possible. when they arrived at the Galapagos, he realized they must have found an environment that they could at least start to utilize, which allowed them to get established. So why do they have different types of beaks? Because they were starting to utilize different types of resources. And each of the islands, and there are about 25, 26 islands that make up the Galapagos group, as the finches were moved from island to island, because again, they're separated by water, they're just far enough apart in the case of many of them that the birds would not voluntarily fly over the water. But again, a storm could carry them over the water. And once they move to a new location, they're confronted with a new environment and perhaps new food resources. And any individuals who could utilize those food resources, Darwin realized, would have a real advantage. And they would be the ones that would thrive, and they would be the ones that would leave behind offspring. And based on what he knew about inheritance, which is not very much, he realized that the offspring would be most likely to inherit the advantages of their parents. And if that happened over long periods of time, you would expect the populations to start to look like the winners here, those that had the advantageous features. There is the basis for natural selection right there. Wallace reached similar sorts of conclusions as he made his observations of organisms in the Indonesian archipelago. So there are a number of observations and assumptions that we know Darwin and Wallace both made, that you have to make in order to reach the point of the idea of natural selection, to develop the idea of natural selection. So I'm moving through this a little bit so that we can look at these observations. So this is where we begin with the observations. So the first observation is that all individuals of a population are not the same. There are differences. And you can see that for yourself. You look around, you look at members of your family, you look at members of any species, and you realize that not all individuals are exactly the same. You can recognize what species they belong to, and some of the differences may be really subtle, but there are differences. And those differences, or those features, are features that are inherited from their parents. So features are passed from one generation to the next. We use the term inherited traits at this point. That's a modern term. But Darwin recognized that features passed from one generation to the next, and that individuals in each generation had these subtle differences. Once you realize that there are these subtle differences, then the next thing to realize is that the individuals in any population, when they reproduce, always produce far more offspring than is necessary for simple replacement. In fact, they typically produce more offspring than their environment, the resources, can support. So the size of the population in any generation of a particular species is always greater than the available resources. So there's obviously going to be competition for those resources. So the question then becomes, if there are competition for those resources, there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. So who are the winners going to be and who are going to be the losers? Well, Darwin realized, and so did Wallace, that the winners are going to be those individuals with the differences that give them the advantage in the utilization of the available resources. Because some individuals are going to have a combination of traits that allow them to utilize the available resources much more effectively than other individuals. Those are the individuals then in any generation of the species that are most likely to thrive, and are most likely to thrive and survive to reproductive age. And as a consequence of thriving and surviving to reproductive age, they're also the individuals who are more likely to leave behind offspring. In fact, they're going to leave behind more offspring than the quote unquote losers. So the offspring in the next generation are going to be significantly greater in number, or those with the advantages, those derived from the individuals that had the advantages, the survivors, the thrivers, the ones that are reproducing. The individuals in the next generation are going to be significantly greater in number, possessing those traits, than those that don't. In other words, the winners will leave behind offspring that look more like them, and those offspring will be a greater percentage of the next generation than those that are the offspring of the quote unquote losers. If this happens over many generations, then it stands to reason that the individuals in the species are going to be more like those that are the winners than those that are the losers. The losers will become less and less prevalent in the population, and the winners will become more and more prevalent, percentage-wise, in the population. And so the makeup of the population, the shape of the population is going to move in the direction of the winners. This is referred to as differential reproduction in modern terminology. And so it's that differential reproduction that is natural selection. Individuals who are better able to utilize their environment are more likely to thrive, more likely to survive, more likely to reproduce, more likely to leave behind offspring that look like them. If this occurs over time and across multiple generations, then over time, each generation contains more and more individuals that look like the thrivers, the winners, the individuals with the best collection of traits, and the less successful individuals leave less and less offspring behind. And so by percentage, the population moves in the direction of the survivors. This is an important observation. Notice that we're not talking about individuals evolving. We're talking about populations evolving, and we'll be talking about that idea in an upcoming chapter. It's a very, very important idea. The unit of evolution is not an individual. Individuals do not evolve, but the makeup of the population does. So it's not individuals that change, it's the nature of the population that changes. It's the makeup of the population that changes. The predominant phenotype or phenotypes of the population that changes as a consequence of more and more individuals in the population carrying those traits. So it's not an individual that evolves, it's a population that evolves. So what would also influence, particularly Darwin, we don't think this influenced Wallace quite so much, but it certainly had an influence over Darwin, because Darwin was a man of independent means. He came from a very wealthy family. His mother was a member of the Wedgwood family that made pottery that was made for the royal family of England, for Queen Victoria and other members of the royal family, as did Darwin's wife, because Darwin actually married his first cousin. And Darwin's father and grandfather were both very famous individuals, physicians, and very wealthy in their own right. So Darwin inherited great wealth. And this is one of the reasons why he could be a naturalist. He actually initially started out training to be a physician at Edinburgh University, but couldn't stand the sight of blood. So transferred to Cambridge and was going to become a minister in the Church of England, but gave that up when he was offered the opportunity to go on the voyage of the Beagle. And in fact, when Darwin was at Cambridge, he was actually known as the Beetle Man because he used to go out on regular beetle collecting expeditions. And if you go to the Museum of Natural History in Cambridge that's associated with Cambridge University, you can actually see a collection of beetles that Darwin collected, plus some of the finches and so forth. Again, in my trip in 2012, I actually went there for the express purpose of seeing that. I went there for a couple of other reasons, but that was one of the major reasons, was to see Darwin's collections and to talk to the librarians in the library, because they have all of Darwin's papers. And I was trying to track down a couple of pieces of correspondence, or at least see if they had come across any evidence of some correspondence. In both cases, the answer was no, but for different reasons. And I may talk about one of those a little bit later. The other was a personal reason. But Darwin was heavily influenced by artificial selection, and that's because, as a man of independent means, he was also a farmer. And when he came back from the Beagle and eventually got married and settled down with his wife in a house in London, he decided that he would like to get a bigger house, and the only place that he could get the bigger house was out in the country. So he and his wife traveled around in Kent, which is in southeast England, looking for a place that they could purchase to set up house and home, where Darwin could set up an office so that he could do his work investigating his specimens and could store his specimens and do some research as he continued in his career as a naturalist and as a biologist. And eventually they settled on the village of Down. And about 2 miles out of the village of Down is the house known as Down House. This is Darwin's property. It's now owned by the National Trust in England, and it's a little museum to Darwin. Well, actually, it's quite a large museum, really. And you can go and visit it. I did. And you can see Darwin's office, and you can see the greenhouse where he did some plant research with his son. You can see another one of his experiments on earthworms in the garden that he did with one of his sons. And we'll talk about that when we talk about earthworms later in the semester, because we will. And you can also go out and walk around a little dirt track called the Sand Walk, where Darwin would go 3 or 4 times a day to walk to get exercise, but also to think. And I took the opportunity to go for a walk around there, and it was quite an experience to know that I was walking where Darwin walked while he did his thinking, as he developed the idea of natural selection and the theory of evolution. For a biologist, it's quite a big deal. It's a very important place to visit for a biologist. So Darwin had this property. He kept sheep and cattle. He had a property manager. They carried out the usual practices of selectively breeding animals to maintain the nature of the animals, to selectively breed for the characteristics they want. He also had a familiarity with pigeon breeding, which was a major hobby in Britain at the time, and recognized and understood that all of the pigeons that were kept by pigeon breeders were actually descendants of a single species of bird called the rock dove that is endemic to Europe. And all of the fancy pigeons, the racing pigeons and different types of pigeons, were all bred by selective breeding out of these rock doves. And so he was familiar with artificial selection and the short amount of time necessary through artificial selection to change the phenotypic makeup of organisms. So here's an example that you may not have seen before. These are what are known as the cruciferous vegetables. They're all descended from this little wild mustard that grows along the coast of Europe. It's called the Arabidopsis thaliana, and we still use it today as a laboratory, quote unquote, lab rat for plant genetics experimentation. because it has a very small genome. It's been completely sequenced. It's very easy to manipulate. And obviously in the past, human agriculturalists have manipulated this in different locations where the plant is grown. So all of these vegetables belong to what's called the now it's the name has the name has left my brain. I've lost it at the moment. The thought has vanished. But they belong to a group. Cruciferous vegetables is the culinary term that's used for them, but there is another name that's given to them. But you have these representatives. So kale was bred to favor the leaves. Brussels sprouts was bred to favor large floral buds. The cabbage was bred to favor a single large floral bud. Broccoli contains multiple tiny little flower buds. You may not know this, but one of these broccoli areas, let me highlight this with my pen again. So one of these things is called a floret. In fact, you may have seen that name used in the supermarket. So floret, flowers. So this is a lot of tiny little flower buds. Cauliflower is you could think of as kind of being a broccoli with the absence of chlorophyll in the buds. And broccoflower is simply broccoli and cauliflower that have been bred together to give a hybrid. And why can they be bred together? Because they belong to the same group of organisms. They're still very, very closely related. Then kohlrabi was bred to favor a storage stem. And then you've got bok choy or Chinese cabbage, and a couple of other members of the cruciferous vegetable group, all derived from the wild mustard by selective breeding in different locations around Europe and Asia where this little wild mustard grows. So this is a really great example of artificial breeding or artificial selection. All Wallace and Darwin said is that nature can do the same thing. If there are environmental selective pressures that favor certain individuals in a population and disfavor other individuals in a population, you can arrive at the same basic point in terms of causing changes in organisms, but it's just going to require time. And of course, Lyell and Hutton provided the opportunity for the time for natural selection to occur. Artificial selection can can alter the phenotypes of organisms in the space of several generations. Natural selection would take longer, multiple generations, because it's slow and it's the accumulation of lots of small changes over a long period of time, or at least that's the way Darwin and Wallace described it. All that's necessary is time. Hutton and Lyell provided the time through their ideas of uniformitarianism and gradualism. So here are the 6 ideas. Well, actually, I think I've got 5 here, not 6, but there are 6 ideas in total. So individuals in population vary. Those that best fit the environment reproduce and do so in high numbers. The favored characteristics are the ones that get passed on because those are the individuals that are breeding. Those that have the unfavorable characteristics tend not to leave more offspring behind, so their characteristics tend not to be passed on over time. The favored characteristics are the ones that are going to accumulate because those are going to be the individuals that are breeding and are going to be present in the highest percentage. The only other thing that we have to state here, this is point number 5, is that the features that are favored have to be appropriate for the time and location. As stated here, regional and timely. In other words, they have to be appropriate at the time and they have to be appropriate in that physical location. So, for instance, if an organism develops a characteristic that at another time or in another location would be very, very important, it's not going to count for anything because it's in the wrong place and it's present at the wrong time. So this is what we mean by regional and timely. So here are some examples of some changes or some adaptations to regional differences. So, and these are all praying mantids. So this one looks like flowers, and this one's actually really tough to see until you realize here's the head, the body, and the legs. Looks very much like the flowers in the background. Here's one that looks more like the twigs of the branches that it's growing on. And here's one that likes to live amongst leaf litter, and you can see that it looks very leaf-like. It even has a vein pattern very similar to the veins of the dried leaves sitting on the ground. So each one of these is a mantid, a praying mantis, but the features that it's showing are appropriate to the location and they're appropriate at this time to allow them to survive. So, time for another break. Again, if you want to take a break, walk away, turn this off, do whatever you feel you need to do. I don't mind. I'm not there with you. You can treat this however you like, but here's the concept check question that I will answer when we come back from the break. So, how does the concept of descent with modification explain both the diversity and diversity of life, the unity and diversity? See you on the other side of the break.